So we're here today to talk about white supremacy and white women in the nonprofit sector. And as always, whenever we start with any of our sessions, we always start off with a land acknowledgement. And so we want to start off by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on today, even though we are meeting virtually. Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwekma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territories. It's important that we're taking this moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since even before the United States was formed as a nation. And while the numbers vary, what we do know is that in the 1400s, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples living throughout the Western Hemisphere. And unfortunately, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous peoples left in the United States. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and their culture, which unfortunately continues to present day. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you to look up the lands that you're on, and Cassie's going to put a link in the chat for you to look it up, and please honor them by entering and typing their names into the chat. We also encourage you to educate yourself about the communities who are native to your land, share your learnings with others, and to take action to support local Indigenous communities when you can. And this map here shows you just a vast variety of the many tribes that were in the US and Canada at one point in time. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Jess. So we want to offer sincere welcome to all of you from Healing Equity United, and we specifically welcome into this space people of all genders. This includes people who are women, men, trans, gender, queer, or others. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We welcome the languages that you all might speak: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure where we might fall on the class spectrum. We welcome people currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like healthcare, affordable housing, reliable transportation, etc. We welcome people who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the way you experience yours. That might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who identify as activists and people who do not. We welcome the single, married, partnered, dating, those in monogamous relationships, those in polyamorous relationships, those who are sexually active, and those who are not. We welcome those who are teens in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or beyond. We welcome your wide range of emotions. That might be joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome those of different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. And last but not least, we welcome people who have been to sessions like these in the past and those who haven't. So most sincerely from Healing Equity United to you, we hope that you found yourself in at least one of these identities. And for that, we say welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. We'd also like to acknowledge that March is Gender Equality Month. And while many of us already are aware that it's also Women's History Month, we like to name that this is Gender Equality Month, which serves as a call to celebrate the history, contributions, and wellness of community members who are impacted by gender-based bias and oppression. We honor and uplift the livelihood of all transgender, non-binary people, women, and girls this month and year-round. We honor the visibility and awareness of the LGBTQIA2 Spirit Plus communities while acknowledging that it's still not a safe place for many people to live openly as their authentic selves within this country. We encourage you to research and support your local grassroots organizations supporting LGBTQ IA2 plus communities and those impacted by gender-based bias and oppression. And with that, we'd like to do some introductions as facilitators. We're not going to read off what might be on our resumes, but we're going to share some of the identities that we come into the space with that informs the work that we do. And so, hello everyone. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial, as I have a white father. I'm originally from the state of New Jersey, though I call the city of Philadelphia home. That's where I used to be a middle school science teacher. I have my master's in education, and I identify as an educator through and through. I also identify as first generation college and master's student as well. I currently, though, live in Seattle, Washington, with my partner who's pictured there, who works in the social work sector, and our dog, Otis, who's pictured there as well. And I also wear the hat as an education director for a small nonprofit called Seattle Works out here.
Thank you, Cassie. And I will be brief and not bore you with my resume. I'll tell you some of the identities that I bring into the space. Actually, I just wanted to pause. I see that some folks are sharing the lands that they're on and which organizations they are with. With the hosts and panelists, wanted to just let you all know that you can also send that information to everyone so we can all get a sense of where y'all are from. So thank you for sharing that. I will share that my people are from Jamaica. You'll see two flags here. I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to being naturalized citizens. So I've always been familiar with the lived experience of immigrant communities, particularly undocumented folks. Having said that, I'm a US citizen. There's a lot of power and privilege that goes along with that identity. How can I leverage that identity to support and lift up immigrant communities and lived experiences? I'm an attorney barred in New York and DC. Always have to acknowledge that being able to put ESQ behind my last name sometimes grants, many times actually, grants my perspectives a certain air of credibility in spaces that it wouldn't alternatively have. I'm from the South Bronx in New York City, community that's primarily Black and Brown, higher rates of crime, poverty, drug use, and love and support. And last but not least, I am married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. We talk about the fact that his immigrant experience substantially differs from everyone else's in my family. We also talk about his white male privilege. And last but not least, for this space, we have 3 biracial children, half Black, half white. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father. Jess?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jess, and I identify as someone who's a first-generation immigrant. Came to the US when I was about 4 years old. I was born in a British colony of Hong Kong and grew up in New York City. My parents were low income, blue collar workers, didn't speak English. I took ESL in elementary school, and when I learned enough English, I became the de facto interpreter and translator for both of my parents. Currently, I live in Oakland, California with my partner, who's a civic engagement organizer, along with our two dogs. Hanson, who is pictured above, is my service dog because I live with an invisible disability. And then Kobe, who's at the bottom, is of course our pandemic puppy. And so I wanted to just spend a moment telling you about Healing Equity United. And so we are a consulting firm. Fiona and I founded Healing Equity United after spending a couple of decades in the nonprofit sector and seeing that even now, when we formed Healing Equity United 5 years ago, that the leadership didn't accurately reflect the communities who we were serving. And so some of the work that we do now is really centered on supporting nonprofits shift their culture to be one focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And as a portion of that process, we provide assessments on their organization, workshops and trainings, and executive coaching and technical assistance. But for today, we're here to talk about what's going on in the nonprofit sector with respect to white supremacy and white women leaders. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is talking about charitable giving and where it came from and how it's impacted the nonprofit sector. We also might want to talk about how white women may serve as gatekeepers in the nonprofit sector, and also to understand what actions we can take to disrupt gatekeeping and harmful norms rooted in white supremacy. So I want to say upfront that we're not talking about every single white woman that's out there. We're just talking, and Cassie will get into this a little bit more. We're talking about white women specifically because of leadership and the numbers that Cassie's going to share with you about who is in leadership. But before we do that, because you all are chatting with everyone, we wanted to set some group agreements in place. So the first one is really that there's no room for oppression Olympics in this space. So that means that, the harms that my community has been facing with anti-Asian hate isn't any worse or less credible than the harm that Fiona and the Black community faces on a daily basis. We're going to cultivate a brave space. We can't guarantee that this is a safe space because we can't guarantee that someone said something in chat that's not going to trigger you or bring up a thought that you've had or an experience that you've had that was negative. But we ask that we cultivate a brave space together. Expect and accept that there might be some challenging moments today. We might be questioning ourselves and the roles that we play. Even for me, as someone who identifies as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, some of the things that we're sharing today are things that I question, in my work, serving on nonprofit boards. We ask that you respect different lived experiences and perspectives that might come up. And we welcome you to say it messy. And so say it messy in terms of like what you're sharing in the chat. Don't feel like you have to write a perfect sentence or paragraph with grammar and everything in check before you send it. What we are asking you to do is to just be authentic and just share what you're thinking in the moment. Be okay with non-closure. So in this 1 hour webinar, we're not going to resolve white supremacy in this space, but know that you may be leaving today with ideas on what might need to happen at your organizations or what we might need to do to further dismantle white supremacy. We also ask that there be some confidentiality. So what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. Some people may be sharing experiences in the chat. And then lastly, take care of yourself. So if you need to get up because your dog needs to go outside, or you need some water, or you just need to take a moment to breathe because some of the things that we are sharing might be a little heavy, please do so. Just really take care of yourself.
Thanks, Jess. And so we're going to shift into a little bit of an opening activity, icebreaker activity, and we're going to be doing that by using Mentimeter. For those of you who have never used Mentimeter, it is very easy. I'm going to drop a link into the chat, and it's going to pull you up a screen for Mentimeter, and we're going to be doing a check-in question. And so while Jess is pulling that up, go ahead and click on that link that I dropped into the chat. And our check-in question, we're just curious about what your thoughts are on the percentage of white leaders in the nonprofit sector. And when we're asking that, we're talking about leadership, we're talking about executive directors, board chairs. What are your thoughts around percentage of white identifying leaders in the nonprofit sector? And so go ahead and pull that up, submit what you are thinking, and Jess is going to pull that up in just a moment.
Yeah, we have about, I think, almost half of you. I'm just going to give it another couple of seconds for you all. And don't worry, it's not a test. It's not like if you don't get the right answer, you're not going to get the recording to this webinar, because all of you will. It's just a way for us to really be thinking about, like, what is the percentage of nonprofit leadership who identify as white, right? Because it's important for us to think about that. And so I'm going to be sharing screen with you all.
Yeah, and I see, Jess, there's some people who did not see that question. If you refresh your page, you should be able to see that correct question asking what is the percentage of white leaders in the nonprofit sector. So go ahead and refresh that page if you are seeing something different. Awesome.
Okay, all right, so let me go ahead and share what's come in. Okay. Here you go, Cassie.
Thanks, Jess. All right, I see most of us are feeling like 80%, around 80% of nonprofit leadership identifies as white. Some folks said 70%. And actually, the correct answer was close to 80%. So it's about 79% of leadership, executive directors, board chairs within the nonprofit sector across the US identify as white. And that is a statistic coming from 2020 from the Urban Institute. All right, so that's a huge majority. And so we wanted to set the tone and talk about that just as we're having this conversation around white women, white supremacy, and gatekeeping within those leadership positions. So thank you all for participating in that. And let's dive into the content. All right, and so we thought it was really important to just give some historical context to charitable giving in the nonprofit sector. And I think it's really important for us to start there because a lot of the nonprofit sector and a lot of the practices, systems, cultural norms are set from being done out of history and habit, okay? And so I just want to note that it's really challenging to kind of summarize the vast history of the nonprofit sector, but we're going to touch on some noteworthy roots that set up the sector to perpetuate white supremacy culture. So to start us off, I'm going to take us all the way back to colonial America. And the US charitable sector has its roots from 1601, the British Statute of Charitable Usage, which that image on the left is a picture of the cover. And this listed a broad range of charitable purposes that later shaped charitable practice within colonial America. And so this encompassed relief for folks who identified as aged, impotent, and poor people, to schools of learning, to marriages of poor maids. British law provided the blueprint for the broadly defined charitable sector, and it also set the tone for the U.S. tax code, and it reflects this kind of heritage from British roots. Okay, and when we think about it, we can also kind of tie this kind of the cultural norm of paternalism to this root as well, if we think about it. So if we fast forward to the progressive era, thinking of kind of the 1920s, This is when social activism collided with kind of a vast wealth growth in the US, particularly within organizations. And so, for example, the YMCA during this time was created during this time, but the YMCA chapters were often led by white women that were connected to wealthy white families, right? And so the ways that issues such as poverty, substance use disorder, and child abuse were addressed from the worldviews of these white women leading those organizations, right? Often not through lived experience, but through a privileged perspective, which might also tie us to the roots of kind of the white savior complex, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Fast forward a little bit, as the US entered the 1940s and World War II, people found it increasingly important to band together to serve communities in need. And during that time, the US government increased their involvement in the nonprofit sector by providing significant grant funding and contracts to organizations such as the Red Cross, which we can see that picture on the right there, who, organizations like the Red Cross were largely white-led due to Jim Crow laws at the time, and other policies that made Black Americans second-class citizens, right? And so while these organizations served their communities in some very important ways, it didn't address the underlying racist policies that Black people faced in particular. And unfortunately, these organizations often perpetuated them as well, right? For example, when we're thinking about redlining during the 40s and 60s. Next slide. All right. So fast forward us a little bit further, moving into the 60s and 70s, when the US experienced both the civil rights movement and the creation of the IRS tax code known as the 501c3 status, nonprofit status, right? So official nonprofit status in the IRS helped to solve the federal government's budget problems in our history. And some policy makers have called for cuts in spending on social services at this time, assuming that the nonprofit sector can fill in those gaps, right? Which is ironic because the nonprofit sector relies on government support to provide these crucial services, right? And so when we think about the charitable sector, right? It exemplified that Black communities knew how to organize, the civil rights movement. When we're thinking about the civil rights movement, this exemplified that Black communities knew how to organize and serve their communities, but were not given equal opportunity to do so, right? Black families continue to lack access to public education during this time. When we think about white flight, schools in the cities would simply close instead of integrating. And during this time, for the nonprofit sector, government programs and organizations made it more difficult to serve BIPOC folks by creating unnecessary guidelines to receive services, right? And so we continue to see these impacts of these programs in use today, such as the temporary assistance for needy families, which creates a poverty cliff so steep that the program penalizes individuals as they strive towards economic self-sufficiency, right? And so I think it's really important for us to note that, again, this white savior industrial complex is inherently wrapped up in this history, right? And this is referring to the institutional merging of practices and processes that validate white privilege, right? Enslavement is an example of this ideology. It reflects racial trauma that began over 400 years ago. And in response to the race-based creation of privilege and oppression, slaveholders served as intervention to provide basic needs and humanization, civility, and morality in exchange for exploitation of labor. Following enslavement, the white savior industrial complex created institutions that were rewarded for saving, quote unquote, saving the less fortunate, while simultaneously engaging in policies and practices that maintain systems of oppression. And so while these last two slides don't depict a complete list of every historical marker that has played a role in why the nonprofit sector continues to be predominantly white, it kind of sets the stage for our conversation. And it's important to note that context. So white women as gatekeepers. Gatekeepers, when we're talking about gatekeepers, these are people who speak for, describe, translate, interpret, count, and determine institutional access for people of the global majority or Black, Indigenous people of color in the process of systemic oppression. Gatekeepers are typically accountable to their bosses and institutions rather than the communities that they serve, and usually help to maintain rather than change the system, right? Because they are benefiting from the current system. They contribute to depriving oppressed people's access to institutions that control their lives. And I think it's really important to note here, while we are talking, again, I know Jess mentioned this earlier, but while we are talking about white women, white leaders in particular as gatekeepers, it's important to note that people of the global majority can also become gatekeepers once in positions of power, right? Subscribing to white supremacy culture is not limited to white identifying people. And so it's important to note that people of the global majority can also perpetuate those harmful power dynamics and become gatekeepers. But we are hoping that as we're having this conversation together, we're moving more towards liberated gatekeeping, right? Using power and privilege and access, an opportunity to break down those gates, right? And so just to talk a little bit more about white women as gatekeepers, just by holding the two identities, socialized as gender female and white, lands a gatekeeping position in our society, right? State-sanctioned protection, right? White women have control and access to knowledge, resources, and advancement within our society, right? And so the graph that we're seeing here on the left, this is from a 2021 study in Race to Lead, and they found that 79% of board chairs, EDs, are white identifying, and close to 80% of leadership in the nonprofit sector of those white identifying folks are women, right? Helping sectors, nonprofit sector in particular, are often pretty heavily female femme leaning, okay? And so this Race to Lead study found that women of color in the nonprofit sector, of the 4,000 nonprofit staff that were surveyed in this study, found that it's clear that there are persistent racial and gender biases that create barriers to advancement for women of color in particular. Women of color reported being passed over for new jobs or promotions in favor of others, including men of color, and white women and white men with comparable or even lower credentials. And so with so many white identifying and white women in particular in leadership positions, it's important that we talk about how white dominant norms or white supremacy culture play a role in keeping white women in power. And so as a reminder, when we're talking about white supremacy culture, we're talking about the ideology, right? The idea that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of the people of the global majority and their ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions. And so we're not talking about specific people, we're talking about the ideology. And so I'm sure many of you have read and seen Tema Okun's white supremacy cultural values. And we have on this slide all of those white supremacy cultural values listed here. And just want to take a moment to note, and Healing Equity United specifically kind of portrays these white supremacy cultural values in this way because power hoarding and fear are necessary to continue to uphold those white dominant norms. And in just a moment, Fiona is going to talk a little bit about how power hoarding and fear in particular are wielded by white women in the nonprofit sector to continue to keep them in positions of power and to attribute gatekeeping.
Thank you, Kathy. And so, as you saw from the previous slide, there are a number of white supremacy cultural norms. And in this slide, we simply pulled out three. One is urgency and perfectionism, power hoarding, and then the fear of open conflict. And so I'm going to go through each of those. So as some of you might be aware, power hoarding is really, it's just like what it sounds. It is knowing that knowledge is power, right? And that keeping gatekeeping is a way of wielding that power. You can do that, and white women in professional and nonprofit spaces often do that in terms of gossip, of how gossip might be a subtle but impactful power hoarding move, right? Control of information about who has access to learning what things and meeting what people. This can also look like CCing BIPOC or members of the global majority who are colleagues on emails, but not actually making space for their voices and contributions during meetings. I will give you a very quick example. At one of the first nonprofit organizations that I worked with, one of the co-executive directors very intentionally brought me into decision-making spaces as an intern. I thought she was very, very progressive in doing that. She was a white woman, an attorney. I was still in law school. But in that space, she didn't invite me to introduce myself. She didn't back up the contributions I made in the space. She didn't validate her reasoning for bringing me into that space, that my contributions should be respected, right? So that's just one example of power hoarding, and like it was a half step towards mitigating that power hoarding, but didn't go quite all the way. Urgency and perfectionism, from our perspectives, often tied to martyrdom and white saviorism. So the idea of martyrdom is that your worth is really dependent on how helpful that you can be, and it can easily turn into over-controlling dynamics and micromanaging. Oh my word. Oh my word. Right? So this notion of, oh, I will bring in this person of the global majority, this BIPOC person, this colleague to do the work, but I'm going to look over your shoulder every second of the day to make sure that you do it correctly, and read between the lines that do it correctly means do it like I would do it, right? And if you're going to do it in some other way, that is inherently wrong, right? So I could go on and on, but then Cassie and Jess would be very angry at me. So I'm going to stick to the messaging here. So that dynamic of like martyrdom and really being helpful, that leads into being micromanaged when folks try to call their white female identified folks, colleagues on it. It's really responded to, I'm just trying to be helpful. I'm just trying to serve the mission, right? And that's what's really valued in our sector, right? But what that can lead to is burnout. I will tell you, and I'll be very transparent, one of my last consulting gigs before Jess and I created this space was of a organization, I'm not going to go into which one, but a white woman who had less experience than me in the field, didn't have advanced degrees, and just all around didn't bring it like I brought it. Required that I CC her on every email that I send out, whether that be a 1 sentence, 2 sentence, hey, just checking in there, I had to CC her. Well, you know, everything happens for a reason. That's how we led to Healing Equity United. Because I was like, I cannot believe this. I really can't believe this, because that was all done in the in the vein of advancing the mission, of ensuring that I was maintaining proper relationships, right? Again, it was gatekeeping. So this is also tied to white saviorism, when white folks and white culture attempts to rescue people of the global majority from their own situation. And there is usually a deep compassion for wanting to do the right thing. But that can become really dangerous when empowering other groups takes away their ability to advocate for themselves and to have and own their own agency. I'll give you a very quick example from the anti-domestic violence space, where a primarily white group of advocates lobbied really hard for there to be criminal accountability for intimate partner violence, right? And that was done out of, a great space of wanting to empower survivors and hold abusers accountable. But because it didn't come from the community of impacted survivors of the global majority, it had a detrimental impact in terms of law enforcement officers coming into communities that were already overly policed, and survivors of the global majority, some of whom chose not to report because they didn't want folks to be detained, uh, arrested, for immigrants to be deported, for a variety of different things. So you can see the double-edged sword there. Then finally, around fear of open conflict. I'm hoping that I got through all of these. So fear of open conflict, and this one is a huge one for me. It's like often women and people socialized to be female or are taught not to rock the boat. And sometimes this is rooted in fear of saying the wrong thing, and silence can perpetuate harm. Oftentimes, when white women do want to share something when conflicts arise, it's said in a passive way, and rooted in white Anglo-Saxon norms of communication, right? I will also say this, I'm going to name this, that fear of open conflict, at least in my experience over the decades of working in the nonprofit space, has often been weaponized, right? A colleague of the global majority says something, and all of a sudden, your white colleague, your white female identified colleague feels threatened, or feels afraid, or is crying, or feels uncomfortable. And now it's no longer about the substantive underlying issue, it's about ensuring that that colleague feels better, right? So I'll leave that there because we want to leave a lot of time for comments and questions. So I know a lot of you came into this space like, so you're talking about all this, but what do you want us to do? One, acknowledge your gatekeeping status, right? If you are in a position of power, if you are at the decision-making table, if you get access to all of the information, share it. And don't half-step it. Share it completely, right? In a way that really promotes agency, right? And for your colleagues who identify as members of the global majority to be empowered, right? Call on your fellow white women colleagues and call them in, right? I can't tell you how many times we've been in spaces and harm occurs and white female identified staff are silent. The meeting's over, or that space has, disbanded. And then they say, colleague of the global majority, I saw that happened and I'm wondering how you're doing. No, 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 no. Don't come after the fact, right? Do something in the moment. Call your colleague in, right? And interrupt what's happening there. We also want to note that there might be some generational differences between older and younger white women. Um, so younger white women often hold older white women um, to, I don't know, dealing with patriarchy and sexism and white male norms in a different way. Um, so for example, in order to advance in your career as an older white woman, you had to internalize some of those harmful norms, right? Um, call them in on that. It might be hard for them to shift, but call them in on that. Sometimes folks need to hear, I need you to be accountable for your white privilege. They might hear they need to shrink or get smaller or be silent. But that's not what we mean by like promoting accountability. It means that it's simply um, acknowledging existing dynamics, right? And then taking action subsequently. Um, Finding space to heal from harm and move from victim to empowered. We don't want folks, I mean, our name is Healing Equity United. And so emotions are a very crucial part of this journey, but we don't want folks to stay stuck in a space of feeling overwhelmed or ashamed or guilt-ridden or angry. It's really important for white women identified colleagues to give space to their emotions, create resources and ways of dealing with those emotions, promoting healing for themselves, but to no longer use that, well, I've experienced oppression too, and so it's okay for me to show up this way. No, no, no. No, 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 my friend. No, 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 it's not. Okay? It's time for you to acknowledge the harm that you might have experienced and then to continue to leverage your privilege. To cultivate a culture of feedback rooted in care, right? So if you see that colleagues of the global majority or other marginalized identities are sharing their experiences and the harm that they might have experienced, if you see that that's being met with defensiveness or dismissal, interrupt that and interrupt it with cultural humility, right? Cultivate a culture of feedback that is person-centered, checking for biases, before sharing feedback. You also want to be direct but use I statements, right? In terms of communication, move past that passive aggressive way of communicating. And you all know what I mean by passive aggressive. So the last one is what else? What else are other actions that folks, white women identified folks can do? You can start putting some in the chat, but we will share some here. Take time to have authentic relationships with colleagues, not just at work, but not just about work, but connecting as whole people, right? Move from being completely theoretical about equity issues to being one of being heartfelt and vulnerable. So moving from your head to your heart and spirit when you approach this work. Jess?
Yeah, so I wanted to definitely just lift up that some of you are putting suggestions in the chat as well. And so, please continue to include them. I wanted to make sure, because we do have a lot of questions coming in, I want to make sure that we move to some of the questions, if everyone's okay with that. And so this is our contact information if you want it. As we move to questions, Katsy's going to drop a link into the chat for an evaluation that we love for you to take. But yeah, let's move over to the questions now. I think that would be good. And so let me ask. Let me just start off with the one of the questions. So Fiona, would you say that creating confusion or withholding decisions is a form of power hoarding?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's also, and I've seen this many times, I'm sure some of you have as well. Confusion is created. I, as a staff member of the global majority, act on the unclear and confused information, thinking that I'm doing what's best. And then it turns out to be wrong, or it leads to additional confusion, but then I'm the one who's held out to dry. I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas the person who started the confusion mum's the word, they're completely silent, missing in action, right? So absolutely.
Another question that came in is it's primarily for the global majority and BIPOC identifying folks on this call. And so one of the questions is, how can we be vulnerable to white women leaders if we don't feel comfortable in this space? And then following that with another similar question of how can global majority BIPOC communities hold white privilege accountable in the workplace, nonprofit organizations? So one is about vulnerability, the other is about holding white privilege accountable.
I've said this many times that I feel like there are two types of people in the world. One is the I'm going to trust you until you have behaved in a way that makes me no longer trust you. And the other type of person is you have to behave in a way that makes me know that I can trust you before I'm going to give my trust. I tend to be the latter. And so what I would say in terms of vulnerability and expecting vulnerability of staff who are members of the global majority, that white folks have to model that change behavior first, right? Many folks have been vulnerable, have shared their pain, especially after 2020. I mean, my God, year after year after year of sharing pain, of sharing experiences, only to be met with, okay, we're going to create change, but only just enough change to make me feel comfortable. So we're going to write that statement, but we're not going to change leadership, right? We're not going to support emerging leaders, right? So my perspective, don't expect vulnerability until you see change behavior. I don't know, Cassie, if you have something different.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And, I think one of the things that first comes to mind for me is strength in numbers. I know that I have needed to lean on other BIPOC colleagues in figuring out whether or not moments of gaslighting were on me or not. And so hopefully you all are able to find those people within your networks, or maybe someone outside of work that you can talk to about this. I think too, more thinking, and Fiona, I love that you named, like, we have to see that vulnerability first. We're not going to do the emotional labor of having to, put ourselves in a vulnerable position, because we often have to do that anyways in predominantly white spaces. But I think one thing that is important to think about, who on your team who identifies as white has shown that they are doing the work, right? Has shown that they can be vulnerable with you. And can you lean on them so that you don't have to do that emotional labor? Who are your co-conspirators who identify as white that you're able to lean on for this? Anything else, Jess?
Yeah, and then lastly, I just want to say that, if there is harassment, report it. If you have in your policies, if you don't have one specifically on harassment, and we've worked with organizations that have one on sexual harassment, but not necessarily when it comes to our social identities, right? Your organization might want to think about having a policy about discrimination and harassment based on race, right? Report it. And then as a last resort, document. This is something that Fiona, my lawyer friend, will say, put things in writing in case you need it in the future. So I want to, we have other questions coming in. I want to make sure that we try to get to some of them. So Cassie, this is early to when you were sharing the history earlier. Was the suffrage movement one of the reasons that white wealthy women became engaged in community work?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we think about the women's suffrage movement, the first person that comes to mind for me is Kimberly Crenshaw. The person, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, coined the term intersectionality. And the women's suffrage movement was not intersectional, right? It was the white women's suffrage movement. Black women in particular were left out of that, right? And so, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that definitely contributes to that. And again, continues into today when we think about women and socialized female folks fighting for women's rights. When we think back to the 2017 March on Washington for reproductive rights, right? Cozy hats, everything was out there, but it was mostly white women, and BIPOC women in particular were left out. And we have to always consider that intersectional piece when we're thinking about those kinds of social justice movements. Fiona, I don't know if you want to add anything onto that.
No, I think that is sufficient. I'm seeing a lot of robust conversation happening in the chat. So I just wanted to lift that up. One thing that stood out to me is if folks see microaggressions and they feel like they've been retaliated against, well, again, as Jess already said, document. I would also, there are two lanes. One is to fight the existing system as much as you are able to do so, right? We don't want to have folks being talked out of jobs and out of salaries. So that's one way. But the other way is remember your power. And if an organization has already demonstrated an inability or an unwillingness to change, it might be time to go. It might be time to go to a space that accepts all of you, appreciates all of you, values all of you, or you might need to create your own space. But that's me being radical. Good, Jess?
Yeah, so I know you have a lot of other questions, and if we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to contact us at info@healingequityunited.com. Sorry that we weren't able to get to the list of questions, but I also wanted to make sure that we give some time to Cassie to kind of close us out and share other things as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And I think just getting back to the last comment that Fiona was making around experiencing microaggressions, harm at your organization, and not getting the support that you need. You are the greatest gift to your organization, right? Organizations are made up of individuals. And so if it does get to a point where particularly BIPOC folks on the call are feeling that it is not a safe space, it is not a space where you are able to show up as your best self, consider, if you are able to do so, what your exit strategy might be, right? You are the greatest gift to your organization. And so again, if you have any questions or follow-up, please reach out to us, and we drop that feedback link into the chat. Please take a few moments to share your feedback with us. I know there's a bunch of comments that came in, so I'll drop it again. And thank you all so much for being here with us today. Jess?